Hello, my name is Nadine and welcome to Hop Along Studio. So on today's video, I wanted to show you some beginner techniques on how to use watercolor paint on your card projects. To make this easier, I cut a piece of hot press watercolor paper to 4 by 5¼ inches. Then I used archival ink to stamp the image, then using embossing powder, added the embossing powder and then heat embossed the image. If you are interested to see how I did this process, I have included the link to that video in the description below. So the first thing you want to do when you're looking at watercolor painting is make sure that you have a good quality brush. They come in a bunch of different shapes, sizes, and brands. The key with a watercolor brush is that it holds a lot of paint. So the key with that is making sure that you choose brushes that are going to work well for you. These whole beam brushes are very good, as well as these DaVinci Cosmo Top Spin ones that I have. I do watercolor painting, but I am not what I would say a full-time watercolor artist, and because of that, I started with some more reasonably priced brushes that maybe be considered a student brush compared to maybe a more serious artist brush. But these DaVinci Cosmo Top Spin brushes, they are also at a little bit more reasonable price point. Another thing you need to understand with these brushes is that they can be damaged quite easily, so do not leave them face down in your water cup. You want to make sure that you are very careful with these bristles so that you do not cause any damage to them. You also want to make sure you have a good set of watercolor paints. My very first set of watercolor paints were these Koi Sakura watercolors. It was a little box of paints, and I used this for quite a while before I started moving up to slightly different paints. I have to say, for a transportable set of watercolors, especially for working outside, this little watercolor sketch box is still what I go to. But when it comes down to doing watercolor at home, I like having a little bit more paint, a little bit more space, a little bit more palette space to work with. I have these great Cotman watercolors. They actually come in tubes, and what I have done is actually squeezed a little bit of them out into my watercolor palette. The thing with watercolors is you actually do want to let them dry. They do become a bit of a pan of watercolor, and then you can dip in your water to be able to mix it really quite well. The Cotman watercolors are considered more of a student grade or a higher student level of watercolor. They are really excellent, especially for where I'm at. You can see here from the sample that I have done, you can actually see where they actually go from light to dark. They are very good for blending. They do what I want them to do, and the biggest thing is they are not as expensive as some of the other things out on the market. I got this as a little set of watercolors and then added in a few extra colors as I went. The nice thing about watercolor is it does last a very long time, so those tiny little tubes that you get might not seem like a lot, but they are very highly pigmented and they have really great colors, and they will last you years, as this set has lasted me years. So the first thing you want to do is wet your watercolors. I don't like using my brushes to originally add watercolor paint to it. A lot of people do. I like using a pipette and a little bit of water, and just adding just a touch of it to each of these just to activate it. And because I have a fair amount of paint in here, I know I'm not going to be dulling the color too much or making it too light by adding a little bit of water in these. I'm not going to do all of them because I'm not using every single color today. But it's a great way of at least getting things wetted and started, and I find it just does a lot less damage to my brushes. Maybe I'm just a little bit less gentle with my brushes than some people. But it allows me to kind of work in a way that my paints are already a little bit wet as I get started. So I have 2 buckets of water that are a little bit off camera here that I'm going to be using for this. I used to only use 1 bucket of water, but one thing I found is that if you are continuing to clean your brush in the water and then you basically go into white or a lighter color, you end up getting not a pure color. So I actually have 1 bucket for basically washing my brush, and the other one I pick up some new clean water to be able to add to my paint. And that way I've maintained more pure colors as I work. So to start with, you basically just want to take, I'm using a little number 2 paintbrush here, dip it in your water. You want to grab a little bit of paint. I've actually already been using red, so I'm just going to add a little bit of extra red to this red. I'm going to add a little bit of this crimson hue as well to this paint. I do really like the intensity of this permanent deep red, but I don't necessarily want it to be so intense the entire time. So one of the keys with watercolor is understanding that you are looking to take a color and then add additional water to it. That's what's going to give you a more lighter blend as you work. So I actually have put my brush into the water, and I'm just going to pick up a little bit of the color. And then I'm going to start from the outside and work my way in. So as you see, by doing it this way, you can actually get shading as you go. This might be hard for you if you've never actually done watercolor before. So honestly, when you're starting out, and this is how I learned when I was starting out, is have your image, but because the embossing resists the paint, it helps you stay within the lines. And until you have much better brush control, maybe look at it as puddling your paint within these little blocks. And again, the more water you add, the more you thin the paint, the lighter the color gets. So it's one of those things of, it's nice to work dark to light, but sometimes I end up going a little lighter than I planned, and then I like to add in a little bit of dark. And you can see here I was a little bit wide with my brush stroke and ended up causing myself to stay out of the line. So what happens when you do that is you can actually take clean water on your brush and wipe it along, and then use a tiny bit of paper towel to basically dab it up. And that way, it doesn't necessarily move it completely, but again, because we're using hot pressed watercolor paper, it doesn't seep in quite as quickly, so it gives you a little bit of working time when you do make those mistakes. And then basically you just need to add back in the color that you want in the places that you want it. And while it's wet, you can always add in some additional color. You can take advantage of what's called blooming, where you can see that it moves a bit as I've been adding in color, it actually does kind of wick along to other areas. And that's the beauty of watercolor, is that you can end up with some really interesting techniques when you actually use the bloom to your advantage. And again, if you find something too dark, you can do what I just did there and basically just dab away the paint that you do not want in a particular spot. And then you can just add some more in. So again, I like putting a little bit of light color in first, and then add in a little bit of darker color once I know that I like the color that I have going on. It's one of those things where a lot of purist watercolorists don't believe you should ever use white. I don't believe you can't use white. I actually have used white from time to time in my work, and it's fine. Like, I think the whole thing is, the idea of the more purist is that you should never use white because you can just have the control of your brush to get to the color you really, really want to have. But for us who are starting in this and are maybe a little less practiced, being able to use white helps us kind of get to the shades that we want. So in this case, I had let this fully dry, so you're not getting the bloom that you would usually get when you add wet on wet. So it's something to think about when you are doing this, that you kind of work in sections and you are careful, because you can end up in a place where you may be adding color in a way that basically forces you to recolor the whole area again, just because you weren't totally paying attention like I was there. And sometimes you don't want necessarily such an even blend, and that's where you can add that second layer of color. The other thing too is, because watercolor is always re-wet, anytime you want to add extra color on it, you will see that it will re-wet. And that way you can end up with some really interesting ways of adding color and dimension. If you don't like something, you don't really have to live with it. You can keep adding color until you're really happy with it. And in this case, I'm going to add a little bit more of this crimson hue. Try to deepen a couple of these spots. And I'm using a size 2 brush just because it works fairly well with this size of image. As I've been watercoloring more, the more I try using bigger brushes to see how I can learn to control the paint better. But in this case, I'm just going to leave it as is. I think the key when you're learning how to do this is it's hard to have good brush control when you're starting. I remember the first few times I watercolored, I kind of had moments of like, this is so frustrating. The paint is going everywhere but where I want it to. And that's part of the reason I like to emboss the image, because it puts you ahead. It brings you from a place of maybe feeling really frustrated with this to, I can do this. I can paint between the lines. And brush work is not easy. Brush work takes a lot of time to master. And so make sure you're gentle to yourself in this process. It's not going to be you're going to learn how to watercolor in a week. But that being said, you can definitely turn your images into something that are really beautiful with a little bit of practice. The other nice thing about watercolor paints is they're very easy to mix, even compared to acrylics. I find you can just blend these colors together to really get the colors you want fairly easily. The more you understand about blending, the easier this becomes. And mastering color blending definitely takes time. It's understanding how these colors all work together, what the base of the colors are, and how they affect the other colors. So it's one of those things of like, give yourself time and practice and play and see what you end up coming up with for this. I actually think this is one of my favorite self-care activities is just painting watercolor. It is a loose medium. It flows. It does its thing. But I find with that looseness forces a little bit lack of control, and there's something that's really quite awesome about being forced to mellow a bit as I work. One thing I mentioned in the previous video that I did about embossing images is basically hot press watercolor paper does not absorb in the same way that cold press watercolor paper does. Cold press watercolor paper, I would say, is probably one of the best ones for doing just pure watercolor work. It absorbs a lot of water, you don't get a lot of buckling, and it takes a lot, so you can actually do layer on layer and get lots of different colors going on in your watercolor painting. The hard thing about it is it isn't really great for stamping. It is not really meant to, it is not a smooth surface, so you're probably going to run into issues with getting kind of the colors that you want from it. And that's where the hot press watercolor paper is really great, because it's used for illustration. It's meant to be fairly smooth, but it's also meant to take water. So by having something that does a little bit of both, makes a really great medium for projects like this, because you can actually stamp it. It doesn't stamp as cleanly as smooth cardstock, but at the same time it really does help you get to that place where you're getting something that has the more watercolor look to it without some of the frustration that can come from cold press watercolor paper. You want to make sure that your brush usually has lots of water in it, because that's what's going to, you want it pooling a little bit on the surface. That's going to let the paint move and do its thing. So that last little bit there, I was actually running into having not quite enough paint on my brush. And you'll start getting a feel for it the more that you do it, but take your time. The first well is really hard. I'm finding that I've realized how much I've improved in my brush control over the last few years, and I've done a lot of acrylic painting in the last few years, so it has really helped with it. But it's made me realize, like, it is not that easy when you're learning watercolor, because you see all these videos and it shows like everyone has great brush control because they have spent a lot of time and a lot of effort getting that great brush control. But at the same time, like you may not have the time nor the desire to do that, and that's where things like this can be really helpful, because again, as you work, it helps you stay within the lines. It helps you kind of get where you want to be with a little less effort. So that was a size 2 brush I'm using. I'm going to move up to a size 4 for doing my leaves. And so in this case, what I want to do is take a little bit of my Viridian hue here, put it off to the side here. I'm going to mix up some new stuff just so you can see how I mix this. And I'm going to put a tiny bit of Hooker's Green in. just to mute that just a tiny little bit. And now I'm going to add a little bit more water to this, and a little bit more water to my brush, and only pick up a little bit of color. Because you can see as I add the water, it does actually affect how the paint moves and reacts. So you don't want to go in too dark, because then it's hard to add the lightness in that maybe you want. So I'm going to go lighter to start with. And you might notice that as I've been moving to a size 4 brush, this brush does carry a lot more water than the size 2. The size 2, 0, 000 brushes are really great for being able to get a little details, but to be honest, it's these larger brushes that help hold so much water, which makes a really big difference. And I shouldn't leave these too long because I don't want the paint to fully dry, because I do want to try to get a more organic mix by using wet on wet. So wet on wet basically means your surface is wet when you're adding other paint. And this is a great green, and I only have a couple greens on my palette, so I'm now going to move to actually, it's a little bit off camera, but a lemon yellow. This lemon yellow I'm going to add it in here, and so you can see it's very, very intense. And I'm just going to add in a little bit more of the viridian there, because that color is kind of taking over, but it gets you this very light green. And that very light green can add a little bit more dimension to the center of your leaves here. Again, brings them a bit of a brighter color. What I really like about that lemon yellow is a very pure yellow. So what's nice about it is it seems to work really well with my greens without getting too dark. So I'm going to come back in with some darker green, and you can see I'm basically just letting this stuff pool on the surface of the paper, and it will absorb as we go. And that's the thing with watercolors. You're not going to be able to control it super well, so don't try. Just kind of accept that it does take a little bit of back and forth to get what you're looking for, and that's totally okay. The more I have learned to just find joy in the fact that it's not always going to be perfect, it's not always going to look perfect, I've found it really quite enjoyable to work in these mediums. Pulling some of that lighter green. In this case, I don't often do this, but because I want just a little bit of extra green on here, I'm just going to pull the darker green straight from the palette. I generally don't try to pull straight from the palette because it's pretty intense, and if you want to try to do more shading and stuff, it's not usually the best way of going about it. But there you go. By letting it dry just a touch, you can basically, it'll help when I'm trying to do the blue and the green on the outside of the pattern. I just don't want it to run too much if I end up having a brush stroke that isn't quite where I want it to be. So I haven't let this completely dry, but it is drier so that we don't have pools of water where I have to worry about trying to navigate them as I am working on the background. I don't like leaving things just kind of hanging in midair, so instead I'm going to take some of this paint that I've already mixed. And I'm going to use a bigger brush. So I don't want it to be the same intensity of color as I've used for the leaves at this point. I want it to be quite a bit lighter. So this is the thing, when you are creating these watercolor projects, it's nice to actually have a difference in color value. So not everything's the same level of intensity. It's nice to actually have some variation in your design, and I think that makes for a much more interesting piece. It makes for just a nicer look, and I do believe that it allows your eye to be drawn to the part of the image that you really do want to showcase. In this case, I feel like this is a little intense, so I'm just going to basically add some more water and pull that on down. Sometimes if you get onto the roses, you can actually clean it up a little bit with a little bit of water, and off you go. And so I do kind of want to let it fade out. So in this case, I'm just going to add some straight water onto here, and it's already very light. So again, it's just, I'm trying to make those brush marks a little less obvious and look a little bit more painterly. It's a fairly intense green. I think I want to go a bit deeper, so I'm going to pull up some of the Viridian. This takes a little bit of practice to be able to blend these in a way that is really kind of, it feels kind of organic and natural and feels great to paint with. At the same time, also kind of leaves these white space areas, and these areas that are a little less intense in color. So, and that's the beauty of this, is you can get to these with one color, you can go from everything from quite dark to quite light. And that's why I only chose a project that had only 2 or 3 colors on it, is I really wanted to show that you don't necessarily need a ton of colors to do some really neat stuff with. And this is where you can just basically do the whole thing in green if you wanted to, but I actually want to add just a little bit of blue. So I'm going to be pulling in a tiny bit of cerulean blue and a little bit of turquoise. I don't necessarily need a ton of it because I want this really watered down. And these are pretty intense colors on their own. The nice thing, if you're doing more than one card and you need a break or whatever, like basically when I did my first test of this project, I basically had already mixed some paint, and then you basically can pull that up when you're doing your next few projects. You don't necessarily have to always remix new paint. You can just re-wet what you have and continue on. And that's the beauty of watercolor, is your paint goes a long way. One, because you're using it to blend and to do a little bit more subtlety in your design. The other thing as well too is basically because it can re-wet, and like acrylic, that once it's dry, that's it. This allows you to re-wet, which allows you to basically use the little bits of paint that you've left over and over again, if that's what you choose to do. And again, because the green and the blue work really nicely together, you can just blend them in and make it a little bit more of a seamless blend as you create your background. And again, like, I don't go all the way out to the edges because you do want to try to leave a little bit of white space to make it feel like it's a little bit more painterly. But that's also where you can grab clear water from the edge and then work your way in. And so you can make it either very subtle, very, very light blue, or you just leave it at white. So you have more than one option when you're working with this. So there you go. As you can see, you end up having a very simple watercolor card that you can attach to a card back, and off you go. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, if you could like it, subscribe to my channel, and let me know if you have any questions about this technique. As well, I have my website, hopalongstudio.com, where I have other creative foundation videos as well as other creative ideas to work towards a habit of self-care in your own life. I hope you have a really great week, and I'll see you next time.